Chapter 1. A light in the dark. It was a bitterly cold January evening in the year 1892 when I found myself once more ensconced in the familiar sitting room of 221B, Baker Street. Outside, a cruel wind shrieked through the chimney pots and rattled the panes, as if London itself protested against the encroaching night. Holmes sat in his armchair, limbs stretched with feline ease, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, while the embers of the fire glowed red and restless in the grate. "Watson," he said, without turning his head, "you have ink on the second knuckle of your left hand, and the warmth in your cheeks tells me your journey was brisk. You have received a letter one of some gravity, judging by the furrow between your brows, and I dare say it could not come from your medical practice." I chuckled, despite myself. "Your powers of deduction never cease to amaze me, Holmes." "Yes, I did receive a letter oddly unsettling, in fact." He turned toward me at last, eyes bright. "Unsettling, you say? Then do not withhold it." I reached into the breast pocket of my overcoat and handed him the folded note. It was written in a careful, almost trembling hand, on thick ivory paper, and bore no return address. Holmes opened it with the same delicacy he reserved for telegrams from the Yard or coded communiques from his brother MYCROFT. "Mr. Holmes, I beg your urgent attention. Something most dreadful is occurring at Braxton Hollow. The candle in my husband's study continues to burn, though it should have long since been extinguished. I believe this is no ordinary phenomenon. It is a warning, or a threat. I can explain. No more in writing. Please come at once. I am afraid to speak aloud even in my own home." "Al Faraday? Holmes murmured. "Braxton Hollow. The name rings only faintly. Do you know it?" I shook my head. "I've not heard of it." But the tone of the letter her fear. It is palpable. "Yes," Holmes said, rising and beginning to pace. "A candle that will not go out. How quaint, how theatrical, and how very suggestive." He reached for his well-thumbed gazetteer and thumbed through it quickly. Braxton Hollow. Ah, here we are. A country estate on the border of Hampshire, near the village of Marnley Cross, owned by a Mr. Basil Faraday, retired solicitor and minor antiquarian. His name appeared once in connection with a case involving a disputed will, but nothing criminal. Of note. Holmes paused, thoughtful. "What intrigues me is not merely the imagery of the undying candle, but the implied threat the lady perceives from it. She does not say she fears her husband. She fears something. Some presence in the house. You intend to go?" I asked. Holmes looked at me with a faint smile. "Watson, when does a candle that defies extinguishment not pique one's curiosity? Especially in a country estate in the dead of winter, with fear thick enough to ink a page? Yes, we leave on the morning train. The next day dawned dim and reluctant. The clouds clung low to the horizon, and the snow that had only dusted London overnight had thickened to a dense white crust by the time we stepped off the train at Marnley Cross Station. The platform was deserted save for a short, red-nosed porter and a liveried coachman who held a placard that read, "Mr. Holmes." "You'll be for Braxton Hollow, then," the man said, touching his cap as he took our cases. "Mrs. said to bring you straight away. Says it's urgent. She does." We climbed into the closed carriage, and soon the village fell behind us, swallowed by the rising mist and the hush of snow-draped lanes. As we traveled, Holmes remained silent, gazing out of the window, his eyes following the narrowing track that twisted into the forested hollows. "Holmes," I said at length, "do you suppose this might be some sort of spiritual manifestation? A ghostly candle?" Holmes snorted lightly. "Ghosts rarely require transportation to a solicitor's study, Watson, but let us reserve judgment. If the candle truly defies all attempts to extinguish it, then either we are faced with a crude illusion or a very clever design." Braxton. Hollow emerged from the trees like a brooding sentinel. The house was a grand but time-worn edifice of gray stone, ivy-clad and half-smothered in frost. Its windows looked black and empty, save for one on the upper floor where, sure enough, a faint, flickering light burned against the winter gloom. We were met at the door by a pale and drawn woman, no older than 40, with anxious gray eyes and a veil pulled loosely around her hair. She introduced herself as Lydia Faraday and welcomed us with evident relief. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot tell you how grateful I am for your swift arrival. I know it must sound mad, but I am not mad. I know what I've seen." "We are here to listen, Mrs. Faraday," Holmes said gently, removing his gloves, "and to observe. Tell us everything from the beginning." She led us to a sitting room where a fire sputtered weakly in the hearth. Tea was brought in by a tight-lipped housekeeper named Mrs. Perks, who watched us with narrowed eyes before retreating. "It began 5 nights ago," Lydia began, clutching a cup between trembling fingers. "Basil, my husband, was working late in his study, as he often does. He collects rare books and was cataloging a volume he had acquired from a private sale. I remember he said it was something unusual, something translated from the Latin." Holmes nodded, but did not interrupt. "That night I retired early. In the morning, Basil had not come to bed. When I went to look for him, the study door was locked. It's not unusual for him to work through the night, so I assumed he had fallen asleep. But he never emerged. Not that day. Not the next. Was the door still locked?" I asked. "Yes, but on the 3rd day the housekeeper said she had seen light coming from beneath the door, and I began to fear something was wrong. We forced it open, but Basil was not inside. The window was shut. No sign of struggle. Only his candle burned just as it is now, and no matter what we do, it refuses to go out." She paused, voice trembling. "We have tried to snuff it, to douse it with water, to let it run out. Nothing works. The flame flickers but does not die. It is as if it waits." Holmes was motionless, his expression unreadable. "And your husband?" "No word, no note, no sign. It is as if he disappeared into the flame." A long silence followed her words. Holmes finally rose. "Mrs. Faraday, may I see the study?" She nodded. "Of course, it is upstairs. But you must understand. It is cold in that room, colder than it should be. And when you stand too near the candle, one feels watched." Holmes offered no comment. He followed her up the creaking staircase, and I trailed behind, every step echoing as though the house held its breath dot at the far end of the upper corridor. She stopped before a door of dark oak, its surface scarred where it had evidently been forced open. She pushed it inward. The study was shrouded in a stillness that unsettled even me. Dust lay thick on the bookshelves, and a musty scent clung to the air like forgotten parchment. but at the desk sat a single brass candlestick and a thin, pale flame that danced in defiance of the draft that crept in under the door. Holmes stepped forward, eyes narrowed, and held his hand near the flame. Then he did something curious. Removed his glove and extended a finger to touch the flame directly. He did not recoil. "Cold," he murmured. "Utterly cold." "Holmes," I exclaimed, "that is impossible." He gave me a sharp glance, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes' interest, and something darker. "No, Watson," he said slowly. "Not impossible, but very deliberate." He turned back to the candle and muttered almost to himself, "The candle that wouldn't die, or the candle that never truly lived." Chapter 2. The soot on the candle wicket was shortly past noon when Holmes and I alighted from our hansom cab in front of No. 7 Greystone Crescent. The air was sodden with mist, the sun a pallid blur above the narrow rooftops of Bloomsbury. The street was quiet, save for the occasional clatter of a coal cart or the distant bell of a muffin man rounding the corner. The house itself was modestly handsome, a 3-story Georgian, dwelling with ivy clinging stubbornly to the red brick facade. A black iron fence skirted the small front garden, in which one could make out frostbitten rose bush and a pair of white stone urns long bereft of flowers. A uniformed constable, looking rather chilled, stood by the gate and gave Holmes a respectful nod. "Inspector Lestrade is inside, sir," the constable offered. "He asked not to be disturbed, but I reckon he'll make an exception for you." "I should hope so," Holmes replied, brushing past him without another word. I followed close behind, notebook already in hand. Inside, the atmosphere changed. At once, the hallway smelled of wax polish and the faint, lingering sweetness of some forgotten perfume. A long Persian runner muffled our steps as we were led into a drawing room where Lestrade stood over a writing desk, examining the now infamous candle with narrowed eyes. He turned at the sound of our entry, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Double quotes, well, if it isn't Mr. Holmes, come to shine your lantern of logic on our little domestic mystery. Holmes smiled thinly. "My lantern of logic burns brightest where others have already groped blindly in the dark. What have you found?" "Not much. The deceased, a certain Professor Archibald Wetherell, Cambridge trained, retired chemist, was found here last night by his maid, Miss Edith Palmer, dead in that chair by the hearth. That's the very candle he was supposedly reading by. Burnt nearly down to the base, yet still alight when the girl found him, though he'd clearly been dead for hours. You'll forgive me, but I fail to see the significance of a stubborn candle." Holmes's eyes glittered as he approached the scene. "Have you considered the nature of wax, Lestrade, or the behavior of combustion in stagnant air?" "I'm not paid to riddle about with candle wax," Lestrade snapped, "but I am paid to rule out foul play, and thus far I haven't found any. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, nothing stolen. Death appears natural, perhaps heart failure." Holmes crouched beside the armchair where Wetherell had expired. A thick Persian rug spread beneath it, the pattern curiously disturbed. At one corner, as though something had been dragged across it. "He was reading?" Holmes asked, pointing to an open volume on the floor. "Yes, Tacitus, apparently. I'd hardly call it bedtime reading." Holmes plucked the book delicately between thumb and forefinger. "Latin, and his spectacles?" On the desk? Then why was the book on the floor and the spectacles not on his person? Lestrade frowned but said nothing. Holmes leaned closer to the candle, his expression sharpening. Curious. There is soot collected around the base of the flame, but not at the top. Almost as though did had been relit recently. You think the maid tampered with it? Holmes waved the suggestion away. Miss Palmer may be a woman of many qualities, but I doubt criminal cunning is one of them. May I speak to her? She's in the kitchen, rather shaken, but I dare say she can answer a few questions. Holmes rose, dusted off his trousers, and glanced briefly at me. Watson, I would be grateful if you made note of the surrounding. Objects here, particularly the hearth rug and that ornamental clock. I suspect their positions are not quite as fixed as Lestrade would have us believe. With that, he strode from the room. I turned my attention to the mantelpiece. The clock in question was a handsome brass piece, ticking with a calm rhythm. But something felt wrong. Its minute hand read 5 minutes to 12, though my own watch showed 12:30 precisely. The hearth rug, too, bore a curious crease as if it had been hastily tugged or folded. Beneath one corner, something glinted faintly. I knelt and retrieved a small object, a button, no larger than a coin, with a floral crest etched into the surface. Lestrade, I called, have you noticed this? The inspector joined me with a frown. He took the button and turned it over in his palm. HMPH, not the professor's style. This looks like something from a woman's coat, or perhaps a servant's frock. But Miss Palmer's uniform had no such embellishment. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. You notice that? I allowed myself a modest smile. I have learned a thing or two from Holmes. Just then Holmes returned, his hands behind his back, and his expression unreadable. Well, Lestrade asked. She found the body at 10:15, Holmes said. She knocked, received no answer, and entered to find him slumped in the chair, the candle still flickering. The fire had gone. Out by then, no coals stirred, no embers glowing. She screamed, alerted the neighbors, and called the constables. All of which matches the timeline, Lestrade said. What are you implying? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He moved instead to the window and drew the curtains slightly. The gray afternoon light spilled across the drawing-room floor. There's a layer of dust on the window latch, he murmured, yet no footprints outside in the flower bed beneath it. Whoever was in this room prior to the maid either entered and exited through conventional means or never left at all. I felt a chill. You suspect someone was hiding here? Holmes nodded slowly. Possibly behind that tapestry. All eyes turned to a large, faded wall hanging on the far end of the room, depicting a pastoral scene of shepherds and sheep, utterly incongruous with the rest of Wetherell's scholarly decor. Holmes swept toward it and pulled it aside with a flourished. Dot behind was a narrow recess, barely large enough for a man to crouch in empty, save for a faint scuff mark on the floorboards and a lingering trace of something chemical. He sniffed, frowned, and took a step back. Watson, do you still carry that small phial of nitrate solution in your bag? I do, I said, retrieving it. Holmes took a clean cloth from the desk, dabbed it lightly in the corner of the recess, then added a drop of the solution. At once, the cloth turned a faint violet hue. Chloral hydrate, he murmured. A. Sedative, tasteless, odorless, often used to render a victim unconscious. Lestrade's face darkened. So Wetherill was drugged? Not necessarily, Holmes said, but someone in this house was. Perhaps even recently. He turned to the fireplace and stared once more at the candle. Its flame flickered softly, innocent and golden. The candle that wouldn't die, Holmes murmured. But perhaps it is the death that wouldn't wait. And with that enigmatic remark, he turned on his heel and strode toward the door. Come, Watson. We must pay a visit to Professor Wetherill's solicitor. I believe he kept offices near Lincoln's Inn. There is more to this man's affairs than meets the eye. Lestrade called after him. And what about the button? Holmes paused. Yes, keep it safe. I dare say it will find its partner soon enough. And then we were gone, leaving behind a half-burned candle, a dead professor, and a room full of questions. Chapter 3. A faint whiff of sulfur. It was just past 11 o'clock. The next morning, when Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes alighted from their hansom cab on the eastern edge of Belgrave Square, the fog had lifted somewhat, revealing the crisp brilliance of a cloudless winter day. Frost still clung to the iron railings, and the air bit with a sharpness that Watson found invigorating. Holmes, however, walked as though unaware of the element's haze. Sharp eyes fixed ahead, his gait purposeful, cane swinging in rhythmic resolve. Lady Adeline Carstairs' townhouse stood tall and elegant, its steps newly scrubbed, and a brass knocker glinting on the dark door. A liveried butler opened at Holmes' knock, his expression shifting ever so slightly at the sight of the consulting detective. "You're expected, Mr. Holmes," he said, stepping aside. "Her ladyship is in the drawing-room." The drawing room was tastefully furnished, with faint traces of wood polish and dried lavender in the air. A fire crackled in the hearth. Lady Adeline, dressed in a dark bottle-green morning gown, rose from her chair with that same austere poise she had displayed the night before. "I trust your night was restful," she said without much warmth. "It was most useful," Holmes replied, giving her a brief bow. "I would be obliged if you could allow us access to the room where Lord Carstairs passed. It is essential we examine the scene before any alterations are made." Lady Adeline inclined her head. "This way, Mr. Holmes. I have kept it as it was." They ascended the carpeted stairs, the silence thick save for the occasional creak of wood. The master bedroom was large and richly appointed. Heavy velvet curtains were half drawn, casting the room in subdued light. A writing desk stood against one wall. Across from it, the great four-poster bed with the late Lord Carstairs had been found. Holmes paused just within the threshold, his eyes scanning the room like a predator, reading tracks in snow. Watson stood to one side, notepad ready. "You will note," Lady Adeline said quietly. The candle on the bedside table. Holmes stepped closer. The candle was half burned, its wax hardened mid-drip, its wick blackened but intact. "You said it remained lit after the death?" Holmes asked. "Yes, the maid found him thus, with the candle still burning. I extinguished it myself only after the constables arrived." Holmes pulled a small glass lens from his pocket and crouched beside the candle. "Curious," he murmured. "Do you detect the scent, Watson?" Watson inhaled. There was something, a faint, acrid odor, just lingering in the air. like the after scent of spent matches or more oddly burnt sulfur. Sulfur, Holmes confirmed, his tone clipped. An unusual scent for a gentleman's bedroom. He moved next to the bedside drawer, gingerly opening it with a handkerchief. Inside lay a few personal effects. A monogrammed watch, a pipe, a box of matches. Holmes picked up the latter, examined the base, and then turned toward the curtains. He ran a finger along the fabric near the windowsill and brought it to his nose. Chloroform has not been used, he said more to himself than the others. No sign of struggle, and yet the man is dead and not from any visible wound. Lady, Adeline, her hands clasped tightly before her, spoke. The doctor said it may have been a seizure or heart failure. Holmes gave a non-committal hum. Doctors say many things when answers evade them. He then made his way to the fireplace, crouching low and studying the ashes. He picked up a piece of charred paper with the tip of his cane, a half-burned. "Note," he said. "Watson, if you please." Watson came forward and took the scrap of paper. Only a few words remained legible. "Will not forgive tonight." "That's all," Holmes nodded. "Add that to the list." Lady Adeline moved no closer, but spoke again. Lord Carstairs had received an anonymous letter the week prior. A threat, he said, though he dismissed it as the work of a crank. "Have you this letter?" "I fear not." He claimed to have destroyed it. "Convenient," Holmes muttered. "Yet I suspect he may have been less cavalier than he let on." Lord Carstairs had the bearing of a man who carefully weighed consequences before acting. He straightened suddenly. "Watson, have you noticed anything peculiar about the position of the bed?" Watson glanced at it. "It seems perfectly ordinary." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Too ordinary. The candle remains undisturbed. The room shows no sign of panic. The man did not fall. He was not attacked. Whatever killed him did so silently and swiftly. I dare say he never expected death at all." The butler reappeared in the doorway. "Pardon me, sir. Inspector Lestrade has arrived." "Show him in," Holmes said without hesitation. Moments later, the familiar figure of Inspector Lestrade entered. His sharp eyes flitted over the occupants of the room before settling on Holmes. "Morning, Mr. Holmes, Doctor. I see you've started without me." Holmes offered a half-smile. "Forgive the head start. Time, as ever, is critical. What have you learned?" Lestrade pulled out a small notebook. No signs of forced entry. No fingerprints, no struggle. The staff all vouch for one another's whereabouts. Seems like a natural death. Holmes raised an eyebrow, and yet the candle remained lit. A candle that should have gone out the moment the man slumped over in death, if his final breath were truly his own. Lestrade frowned. "You don't think it was a stroke?" "I think," Holmes said, stepping closer, "that Lord Carstairs was murdered. And whoever did it is clever, very clever indeed." Lady Adeline's face paled slightly. "I shall need to speak with the house staff," Holmes added. "Every one of them." "Certainly," she said, regaining composure. "Mrs. Draycourt, the housekeeper, will assemble them and the servants." Paul. As she turned to go, Holmes caught Watson's eye and gave a subtle nod. He would play the game now, peel back the layers, and see what secrets lay buried beneath the silk of this genteel house. Chapter 4. The Shadow in the Smoke. Gaslights burned low in Hampstead as Holmes and I arrived at a narrow street bordered by stately elms. their skeletal branches curling like fingers into the fog-laced air. Number 12 Valiment Lane was a modest, two-storied Georgian affair, tucked among a row of houses that bore the silent austerity of middle-class respectability. It was just past 10 o'clock, a socially impolite hour for calling uninvited, and yet Holmes showed no hesitation as he rang the bell with his usual crisp efficiency. A few moments passed before the door opened with a reluctant creak. Standing, there was a man in his early 60s, his thinning silver hair disheveled, and his spectacles dangling precariously from the bridge of his nose. A pen, freshly dipped, remained clutched in his ink-stained fingers, and the faint odor of sealing. Wax drifted out into the night. Double quotes, Mr. Alfred Branscombe? Holmes inquired politely. The man blinked at us in confusion. Yes, and you must be Sherlock Holmes, Holmes said, presenting his card. And this is my associate, Dr. John Watson. Forgive the late hour, but this matter requires some urgency. Branscombe hesitated, clearly caught between professional etiquette and visible fatigue. Yes, of course. I wasn't expecting you until the morning, but please do come in. The interior was warm and dimly lit. Persian rugs soft the floors, and a pervasive scent of aged books and tobacco lingered in the air. Holmes followed Branscombe into a study crowded with ledgers, scrolls, and shelves brimming with neatly ordered documents. A worn leather armchair stood near the hearth, where a fire crackled lazily, casting flickering shadows across the walls lined with oak panels. Sit, please, Branscombe offered, pushing aside a pile of correspondence from one of two chairs facing his desk. He took the other, brushing a bit of dust from his waistcoat with nervous fingers. You were Lord Huxley's solicitor for many years? Holmes asked, once we were seated. Indeed, Branscombe replied, placing his spectacles back on. Since 1872, he was a man of particular temperament, old-fashioned, stern, but not cruel, a traditionalist, if ever there was one. Did he ever express fear or paranoia toward the end of his life? The solicitor narrowed his eyes. Fear? That's rather strong, but I will admit his behavior grew more peculiar over the past year. He became secretive, installed new locks on his bedroom, refused visitors after dusk. Did this coincide with any event you know of? An illness, perhaps? A confrontation? Branscombe tapped his chin. No illness to speak of, at least not physically. But mentally? There were hints of obsession, most of it centered on a certain object he kept in his possession. Holmes's expression sharpened. What object? Branscombe stood and moved to a filing cabinet. He extracted a manila folder, carefully laid it on the desk, and produced a typewritten sheet. 6 months ago, Lord Huxley summoned me to rewrite his will. He instructed me to add a very specific clause regarding an heirloom he kept in his bedroom, an iron candle holder. A candle holder? I repeated, surprised. What was so significant about it? Branscombe nodded solemnly. I asked him the same. He said it was a family relic, that it must never, under any circumstances, be removed from the estate. If it were, the inheritance would not pass to his designated heir, Mr. Cedric Huxley, but instead to the Royal Botanical Society of London. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. A botanical society? Holmes echoed. Curious, Branscombe shrugged. I thought it exceedingly strange. But Lord Huxley insists said he feared what might happen if the artifact left the house. What did it look like? Holmes asked. Branscombe drew a simple sketch from the folder. It was an austere thing, Gothic in style, with ornate vines twisting around the stem and a Latin inscription ringing its base. Lux umbra regit. Holmes read it aloud. The light governs the shadow. Exactly, Branscombe said, pouring himself a small glass of sherry from a nearby decanter. He offered us some, but Holmes politely declined. Did you ever see it in person? Once. He showed it to me briefly after signing the new will. It sat on a carved stand near his writing desk unlit. He warned me not to touch it. Did Cedric Huxley know about this clause? I can't be sure, Branscombe said. He was present at the earlier readings of the will, but the final clause was inserted in secret. Lord Huxley specifically requested I withhold that portion until after his death, unless certain conditions were met, such as if the candle holder were ever removed or lit by someone unauthorized. I shifted in my seat. Do you believe that clause has anything to do with Lord Huxley's death? Branscombe stiffened slightly. Dr. Watson, I'm not a superstitious man, but I remember the look in his eyes when he added that clause. He was afraid, genuinely afraid, and not just of people, of something else. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Was Lord Huxley in the habit of taking laudanum, or any medications that might cause hallucinations? Branscombe shook his head. None that I ever observed. His mind was sharp, obsessive, yes, but sound. Holmes stood. You have been most helpful, Mr. Branscombe. I may need to call upon you again. As we made our way down the front steps, I noted the stillness of the night. The fog had thickened, clinging to the gas lamps and giving them the appearance of dimly glowing halos. Well, I said quietly, what do you make of it, Holmes? Holmes didn't answer at first. He lit a cigarette with deliberate calm, the flick of his match momentarily casting light across his angular features. A candle holder, he murmured, bound by claws, guarded by fear, and somehow central to a man's last moments. And now the smell of sulfur and the tale of a flame that refuses to die. You believe it was all staged? I believe nothing yet, Holmes said flatly, but the candle is not mere ornamentation. It is a symbol or perhaps a lever. We flagged down a hansom and climbed inside. The gaslight from the cab's interior flickered in time with the horse's hoofbeats, and Holmes sat in silent contemplation the entire journey back to Baker Street. When we arrived, the night had grown colder. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual fussing. A telegram came while you were out, Mr. Holmes, she said, handing him a sealed envelope. Delivered by a street boy, didn't say who sent it. Holmes took it without comment, broke the seal, and read the contents. His brow furrowed. What is it? I asked, setting down my coat. Holmes handed me the note. The paper was thick, expensive, and bore no signature. The message was written in an elegant, slanted hand. You seek shadows in the wrong direction. Leave the candle unlit or share his fate. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Holmes folded the note neatly and slid it into a drawer. Well, he said, turning to me with eyes that glinted like steel. That answers one question at least. What question? He smiled coldly. Whether someone is watching us. And the answer, Watson, is yes. Chapter 5. The Flames of Doubt. The morning mist hung heavy over Baker Street, lending the air a peculiar dampness that clung to the windows and distorted the gaslight from within. I found Holmes at his usual station by the hearth, a half-consumed pipe in one hand and a small envelope in the other. He had been uncharacteristically silent since our return from the Langham Hotel the previous evening, where the curious matter of the extinguished candle had first been laid at our feet. The envelope, I noticed, bore the monogram of Lady Eugenia. Rachel, the matriarch of the household where the inexplicable incident had occurred. Without a word, Holmes handed it to me. I broke the wax seal and read aloud that, "My dear Mr. Holmes, there has been a further development. Last night, after your departure, my late husband's study was found in disarray. Nothing appears to have been taken, and yet drawers were opened, books pulled from the shelves, and the fire left smoldering, though no one had lit it since his passing. I implore you to return at your earliest convenience. I am most unsettled. Yours faithfully, Eugenia Greville Holmes." Tapped his pipe against the grate with deliberate calm. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the set of law journals on the third shelf of Sir Robert's study? I do, leather-bound, faded at the spine." "Precisely. There was a single volume missing, though the dust indicated it had remained undisturbed for years. I suspect it was taken not out of curiosity, but to reach something concealed behind it. You think someone returned last night to retrieve it?" Holmes rose, his energy seemingly renewed, "or to ensure it remained concealed. Either way, we must waste no time." By midday, we had returned to the Greville estate. Lady Eugenia greeted, use in a state of fragile composure, her hands gloved in black lace, her voice steady but thin. The maid discovered the room in that state early this morning. I locked it at once and awaited your arrival." Holmes nodded gravely. "No one entered after you locked it? Not a soul." We made our way down the hall to the late Sir Robert's study. Holmes unlocked the door with the key Lady Eugenia had provided and entered the room with the caution of a man expecting an ambush. That the once orderly room was indeed disturbed. Papers lay scattered on the writing desk, and several books had been thrown haphazardly onto the floor. The air held the lingering scent of burnt paper and something else, bitter, metallic, almost medicinal. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, crouching by the hearth. "Charred remains of what appear to be parchment, not the sort typically kept in a lawyer's possession." I knelt beside him. "There's a seal," I said, pointing to a scrap that had partially survived the flames. Holmes used his lens to inspect it. "A falcon rampant heraldic. This is not English in design. Possibly continental." He turned to Lady Eugenia. "Did your husband maintain foreign correspondence?" She hesitated. "Not since his days as a young barrister. There was a case years ago involving an Italian industrialist. Some dispute over maritime patents. It caused him great distress, but he spoke of it only once." Holmes stood abruptly. "And the candle, Lady Greville? Was it burned again last night?" "No," she said with a slight tremble. "It was untouched. I went to look. It remains precisely where it was when you saw it last." Holmes moved to the shelf of legal tomes and began pulling them forward one by one. He stopped at a slight depression in the dust and inserted his long fingers. A soft click echoed, and a panel at the back of the shelf slid open. Behind it lay a narrow cavity containing a single item, a silver candelabrum, smaller than the ones in the dining room, with a curious inscription etched around its base. Per Lucem Veritas, through light, truth. Holmes held it up to the window light and turned it slowly in his hands. Fascinating, he murmured. Watson stepped closer. Is it of any real value? In and of itself? Perhaps not. But as a symbol, possibly the key to the whole affair. We returned to the drawing room, and Holmes requested tea, while Lady Eugenia busied herself with the staff. Holmes beckoned me to the window. Watson, I must tell you something that I refrained from mentioning until I was certain. When I examined a so-called ever-burning candle yesterday, I found residue not of wax, but of tallow mixed with phosphorus. I blinked. Phosphorus? That would explain the brightness and the unnatural persistence. Precisely. But more importantly, it suggests a deliberate design. Someone wanted to create the illusion of supernatural persistence, a flame that would not do so as to frighten or mislead. But why? Because, Holmes said, lowering his voice, there is something in this house, some truth connected to Sir Robert's past, that someone is willing to use trickery, even fear, to keep hidden. Tea passed with little conversation. Holmes appeared preoccupied, his brow furrowed in concentration as he stirred his cup absently. At last he rose. Lady Greville, you mentioned a maritime case from your husband's past. Do you recall the name of the Italian client? She frowned. Giovanni ... Giovanni Bellano, I believe. Holmes' expression sharpened. Are you certain? Yes, I am. Why? But Holmes only smiled faintly. Merely a coincidence, perhaps. As we departed, he turned to M.E. and said quietly, Bellano disappeared in 1882 under mysterious circumstances. His body was never found. You think Sir Robert had something to do with it? I think, Watson, that Sir Robert may have carried a secret to his grave, and someone fears we may be about to exhume it. That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes spent hours at the desk with his files and newspaper clippings. He pored over court records, articles from foreign presses, and archived telegrams. When at last he leaned back and steepled his fingers, I knew a revelation was forming. What have you found? I asked. 3 deaths, Watson. 3 men, all linked to Bellano's shipping consortium. Each died under unusual circumstances in the past 15 years. One fell from a pier in Trieste. Another was found poisoned in Paris. And the third, Sir Robert Greville, allegedly died of natural causes. But you suspect otherwise? Holmes gave a cold smile. I suspect the candle was merely the overture to a long-forgotten crime, and the curtain has only begun to rise. Chapter: The Voice Beneath the Flame. Though the flickering candle in the chamber of Mr. Pembroke had been extinguished countless times, its return to life burning anew without match nor spark had unnerved even the stout-hearted. But Sherlock Holmes was not of the superstitious breed. As we rode in the hired brougham back toward our lodgings on Baker Street, I noted his stillness. He was utterly absorbed in some train of thought, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed beneath the brim of his hat. I confess, said I, that Mr. Pembroke's tale has rattled even me. A candle that reignites itself long after it has been snuffed, and without anyone else in the room? Indeed, Watson, he murmured. But remember supernatural explanations. are invariably placeholders for that which we have yet to understand. Then you suspect trickery? Holmes did not respond at once. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a small notebook upon which he began scribbling furiously, occasionally glancing upward, as if calculating the dimensions of the Pembroke estate in his mind's eye. "It is not the candle itself which interests me," he said after a moment, "but rather what Mr. Pembroke did not say." "Did not say? He is withholding something, and it is not fear that binds his tongue, it is shame." I looked at him askance. "You deduce this from what, exactly?" Holmes closed the notebook and returned it to his pocket. "From his shoes, Watson. They were lightly dusted with white powder chalk or lime, more commonly found in catacombs or old construction sites than on the polished floors of a nobleman's drawing room. And yet he claimed he hadn't been below ground in days. Curious, wouldn't you say?" Before I could respond, the brougham pulled to a halt outside 221B Baker Street. The lamps cast golden halos upon the mist that crept in off the Thames. It was nearly midnight, and the street was deserted save for the distant clatter of a cab turning onto Oxford Street. Inside our quarters, Mrs. Hudson had kindly left a tray with hot tea and oat biscuits. Holmes barely noticed. He tossed his overcoat aside and flung himself into his chair, fingers twitching. "I believe," he said, "that it is time we paid a more clandestine visit to Pembroke Manor." I nearly choked on my tea. Tonight? Holmes was already unwrapping a bundle from beneath the hearth, his familiar disguise kit dot. By 1:30, we were creeping through the moonless dark of Pembroke's private garden. Holmes had donned the warm garments of a chimney sweep. Soot applied liberally to his face, while I less convincingly played the part of an aging gardener, stooped and hobbling. We had scaled the stone wall at the rear of the estate using a rope Holmes had prepared earlier, and now crept beneath hedges and overgrown ivy until we reached the servants' wing. "This way," Holmes whispered, pointing to a narrow side door we had observed earlier during our daytime visit. The door yielded to Holmes' lockpick with a soft click, and soon we were moving silently through the tiled hallway. The air was heavy with the scent of extinguished oil lamps and lavender polish. Every creak of the floorboards beneath our feet felt thunderous. Holmes paused at the base of a spiral staircase. "His room is at the top," he whispered. "But we are not heading there." "Then where?" "The cellars." We descended instead into the bowels of the house, where stone steps curved into the earth like the throat of some ancient beast. The scent changed. Dampness mingled with a faint, metallic tang iron, perhaps. The candle Holmes carried cast feeble shadows along the rough walls, and for a moment I fancied I heard the faintest whisper of movement ahead. The cellar door creaked open to reveal a vast underground chamber lined with crumbling brick. Several crates lay stacked near a rusted boiler, but what caught our eye was a narrow archway at the far end, partially bricked up, as though someone had attempted to conceal a passage and thought better of it halfway. "Watson," Holmes said, softly, his voice suddenly cold and serious, "would you examine the wall just to the left?" I stepped forward and noticed it a smear of fresh white chalk along the edge of a brick. Holmes knelt and scraped it with a penknife, sniffing it. "Afterward, lime dust," he confirmed. "Recently disturbed." He pressed a hand to the wall and began searching with his fingertips. After a few moments there was a hollow click, and a panel of bricks shifted inward. A hidden latch. Holmes swung the section aside, revealing a narrow tunnel just wide enough for one man. Do you suppose it leads to the chapel ruins behind the house? I asked. Possibly, but that is not why we're here. Follow me closely. We crept into the passage, the candle flickering wildly against the cool drafts from within. The walls were covered in soot and handprints. Somewhere ahead, a faint sound echoed, a low, rhythmic murmur that raised the hairs on my neck. We emerged into a small chamber that reeked of tallow and oil. Candles, dozens of them, were arranged along a low stone altar in the center, and behind them, affixed to the wall with iron nails, was a grotesque painting of a faceless figure in black robes. Good Lord, I whispered. Holmes examined the scene with careful detachment. We are not merely investigating a haunted candle. Watson, this is something far older and infinitely more calculated. He pointed toward a small brass mechanism fixed to the underside of the altar. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a spring-loaded device attached to a glass wick reservoir. A thin rubber tube ran from it along the wall, disappearing behind the bricks, presumably leading to Mr. Pembroke's chamber. An ignition system, Holmes muttered. Ingenious. A slow-burning fuse, likely triggered elsewhere in the house. The candle in Pembroke's room is not reigniting by magic, Watson. It is being lit remotely. And the purpose of this chamber? Holmes' eyes darkened. Intimidation, ritual, psychological warfare. Someone is trying to drive Pembroke mad or make him believe he is being haunted. At that moment, we heard a sound of footstep above. Holmes blew out the candle, plunging us into darkness. We held our breath as the footsteps drew nearer, pausing just above our heads. Then a voice, low and raspy, broke the silence. It will burn again, my lord. It always burns again. The footsteps retreated, leaving silence once more. Holmes turned to me, his voice tight. We are not alone in this house tonight, Watson, and whoever is behind this intends to bring the flames to life once more. Chapter 7. The Ink Stained. Testament. The next morning dawned gray and dim, with a wind whistling through Baker Street like a herald of some invisible specter. Holmes, already fully dressed and pacing the drawing-room with his habitual restlessness, glanced up as I descended the stairs. "Good morning, Watson," he said briskly. "Our ghostly candle continues to flicker, but this morning I intend to snuff out more than just superstition." I poured myself a cup of tea and took a seat. Holmes looked as though he had hardly slept. His violin sat untouched in the corner, a sure sign that his thoughts had been wholly occupied. "You have a plan, I take." "It?" He nodded. "Yes, but before that, we must revisit the hall. Inspector Lestrade is meeting us there with a warrant to search the West Wing specifically, the study of the late Reginald Faraday." I raised an eyebrow. "You believe the answer lies with the dead man himself?" "Perhaps not the man, Watson," Holmes replied, eyes glinting, "but his past. There is something in his records. I suspect some trace of unfinished business." By noon, we had arrived once more at Carrington Hall. The sky above had turned an ominous charcoal, and the vast structure seemed to brood beneath it like a dormant creature. Inside, Lestrade was already waiting, standing impatiently in the tiled foyer, his overcoat dusted with rain. "You've got your warrant," he said without ceremony, producing a sealed document. But I'll warn you now, Holmes' Lady Eleanor isn't pleased. She says this is ghoulish. Truth often is, Lestrade, Holmes murmured. Shall we? We made our way to the west wing, where Faraday's study lay untouched since his death. The room, paneled in dark mahogany and lined with grim legal tomes, was precisely what one might expect from a retired solicitor's save for the curious arrangement of candles on the fireplace mantel. Rather a profusion of wax for a man reputed to be practical, I said, examining the numerous candlesticks. Some were burned halfway down, others not at all. Holmes moved to the large oak desk and began sifting methodically through drawers. His movements were meticulous, with none of the erratic urgency I had seen in the previous days. A man like Faraday, Holmes began, would keep his secrets close and written. Look here, Watson. He held up a bundle of yellowing papers, bound with a faded green ribbon. Legal correspondence, wills, testimonials, property disputes. He froze. Watson, look at this. He handed me a document with a broken wax seal. It was a letter one of confession. It seemed dated nearly 10 years prior. The signature read, B. Elliston. I scanned the first few lines and looked up in astonishment. Elliston? That's the same name as the steward who took his own life on the estate 7 years ago, Holmes finished. Yes, I remember the case. It was chalked up to melancholia, though the coroner noted rope burns inconsistent with a simple hanging. Faraday had managed the legal proceedings surrounding the estate's land dispute around that very time. Holmes rifled further and uncovered a folded parchment, a last will and testament penned in ink barely faded. Here, Watson, dated a full year before Faraday's death. But look closer, this version named someone else as heir to the West Vineyard estate. I examined the document. Indeed, the name Edward Ballantyne was scrawled where I expected to see Lady Eleanor Carrington. Who is Ballantyne? I asked. Unknown to me, Holmes replied, but clearly known to Faraday, and clearly disinherited in later versions. Lestrade, who had been hovering uncertainly by the door, now stepped forward. Are you suggesting Lady Eleanor tampered with the will? Holmes gave a faint smile. I suggest nothing yet, but I propose we find out who this Edward Ballantyne is. Watson, I'll need you to send a telegram to the records office. Request any birth, land, or probate records for that name in connection with the counties of Norfolk and Hampshire. I nodded and took to the task immediately. As I stepped out into the main hallway, I nearly collided with the nervous housemaid Esther, if memory served, who had been carrying a tray of unlit candles. She gasped and nearly dropped them. Beg pardon, Doctor, she cried. I didn't see you. Quite all right. Are those from the West Wing? She looked about cautiously and nodded. Lady Eleanor had them removed, she whispered. Said they were attracting too much trouble, but the staff say they still burn some nights. Still, she nodded slowly. Even when locked, I thanked her and returned to the study. Holmes was now examining the fireplace. He crouched beside it and ran his fingers along the inner brickwork. Watson, fetch. My lens, will you? He took it and held it against the edge of the hearth, then pressed gently. With a soft click, a hidden compartment slid open from beneath the mantel. Aha! Inside was a single candle identical to the ones that had continued to burn night after night. Holmes took it carefully in gloved hands. This one, he murmured, is different. Look here, the base is hollowed and filled with some kind of powder. My guess is phosphorus or another slow-burning compound. Ingeniously done. And this wick is treated. That explains the perpetual lighting even in sealed rooms. But who would go to such lengths to stage a supernatural phenomenon? A question of inheritance, Watson, and of guilt, perhaps. Someone wanted the presence of Reginald Faraday to linger, not as memory, but as threat. Just then, footsteps sounded in the hall. It was Lady Eleanor. I should have known I would find. "You here, Mr. Holmes," she said coldly. "What right have you to paw through my uncle's private things?" Holmes turned and bowed slightly. "The law grants us the right, Lady Carrington. I have no desire to intrude unnecessarily, but I must ask due. You know a man by the name of Edward Valentine?" The question struck her like a slap. Her mouth parted, but no words came for several seconds. I do not," she said eventually. "Should I? Perhaps not. But it may interest you to know that in an earlier draft of Reginald Faraday's will, he was listed as sole heir to the West Vineyards." Her knuckles went white as she gripped the doorframe. Then, without another word, she turned and left. Holmes stood in silence for a moment, watching the empty space where she had been. "There's our ghost, Watson," he said finally. "And I think it's not the candle that refuses to die, but the truth." Chapter: The Vicar's Folly. Though the fog had receded with the dawn, a heaviness still hung about the village of Netherdean, as if the mystery itself had leached into the trees and cottages. Holmes and I breakfasted at the modest village inn with little conversation. My companion's brow remained furrowed, his fingers steepled in thought, eyes fixed on a spot beyond the window as he contemplated the peculiar pattern of events that had led us here. It was nearing 10:30 when we returned to the vicarage. By appointment, the Reverend Josiah Halbert awaited us in his study, a modest but dignified room, its air tinged faintly with pipe smoke and the scent of aged paper. A beam of sunlight fell across his worn desk, upon which lay his Bible, a stack of correspondence, and most notably a small silver candlestick. Holmes's gaze went immediately to it. "You'll forgive the intrusion, Reverend," said Holmes, bowing slightly. "I believe we agreed upon a frank conversation." "Indeed we did, Mr. Holmes," Halbert replied. His tone was polite but guarded, like a man offering hospitality to a guest who might also be a threat. "I've nothing to hide." "Splendid," Holmes said, seating himself in one of the hard-backed chairs. "Then let us begin with the matter of the candle. You said you had lit it during your prayer at Compline and left it burning, and yet it was found extinguished and relit without explanation, and without a trace of wax on the floor." The vicar clasped his hands and sighed. "I cannot account for it, sir. I went to bed shortly after midnight, and when I returned, the following morning the candle was fully lit again, yet burned down only an inch. No draught in that room could have blown it out. I've conducted service there for 7 years." Watson, feeling the need to prompt, added, "Could someone have entered the chapel and tampered with it?" "No one has a key but myself and the curate, Mr. Lyle." "And where was Mr. Lyle at the time?" Holmes asked. "At his sister's in Lewes. He left 2 days prior and only returned yesterday evening." Holmes leaned forward. "Then we must suppose, Reverend, that someone not in possession of a key either found a way into the locked chapel or never left it." Halbert paled. Are you suggesting someone was hiding within? Not suggesting, Reverend. Only eliminating no possibility. Might I examine the key you keep? The vicar removed a heavy iron key from a drawer and handed it over. Holmes studied it closely, noting the scratches on the shaft, the teeth worn from frequent use. Thank you, Holmes said, returning it. Now to the matter of your sermon the morning after the candle's mysterious extinguishing. You quoted, I believe, from Matthew 25, "Watch therefore, for the know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh," a passage on vigilance. Halberd nodded, uncertain. You are aware, are you not, that the same passage was underlined in Lady Bramhall's copy of Scripture? The vicar stiffened slightly. I was not. Holmes studied him with narrow eyes. And yet Lady Bramhall was seen at Vespers only 3 days before her death. She had been perturbed, some said anxious. Did she seek counsel from you, Reverend? A pause. She came to confession the previous week, the vicar said at last. But I cannot divulge its content. That is sacred. I respect the sacrament, Holmes said quietly. But let me ask you this, was she afraid? The vicar's throat bobbed. Yes, he admitted, though she said little of substance. She claimed to be troubled by a dream that kept recurring, a candle that refused to go out even as the wind tore through her chambers. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. A curious image, Holmes murmured, and she said nothing of its meaning? No, only that she feared it was a warning. Before Holmes could press further, the door to the study opened and a slight, pale woman entered. She looked to be no more than 25, with fair hair pulled tightly beneath a nurse's cap. I'm sorry to interrupt. Father, she said with a nervous glance, Mrs. Quince is here for the parish donation book. The vicar turned to us. This is Miss Anna Marsh, our parish nurse and organist. Holmes stood and bowed. A pleasure, Miss Marsh. You were present, I believe, on the evening of Lady Bramhall's passing? Yes, she said, her hands clutching the folds of her skirt. I found her, actually. Indeed? Holmes's interest quickened. Might I impose upon your recollection? What state was the room in? Anything. Out of place? Anna hesitated. Only the candle. It was burned nearly to its end, but the windows were wide open, and yet the flame was steady unnaturally so, as though protected by something. And she stopped, biting her lip. Holmes encouraged gently. Yes, there was a smell, not wax, something sharper, almost like oil. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Interesting. We thanked the vicar and took our leave shortly thereafter. Once in the lane, I turned to Holmes. What do you suppose? Tampered wax? An accelerant? Possibly. Or perhaps an artificial means of reigniting it, something concealed within the candle itself. He fell into silence, walking quickly, thoughts churning visibly. We passed several villagers, who watched Holmes with a mix of suspicion and awe. Nether Dean was not used to strangers, least of all one whose presence made their secrets tremble. Back at the inn, Holmes requested paper and ink and immediately began sketching something while muttering under his breath. What is it? I asked. The mechanism, he said. Imagine a wax shell with a hidden core, perhaps a second wick laced with an oil that ignites upon air exposure after a delay. It could explain the candle's resurrection. And the symbolism? What would be the point? Ah, Watson, that is the most telling part. The candle is not the murder weapon, it is the message. He stood abruptly and rang for the innkeeper. We must visit Lady Bramhall's solicitor, Holmes announced. I believe her will may reveal more than her candle ever could. Chapter 9. The Hidden Flame. It was a gray, blustery morning when Holmes and I returned once more to Ashgrave Manor. The clouds hung low over the Surrey landscape, casting long shadows across the fields and woods surrounding the house, which now seemed even more sinister than when we had first arrived. Inspector Lestrade met us at the gate, his brow furrowed and eyes sharp with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. I suppose you're here to look at the chapel again, Mr. Holmes, he said by way of greeting. Holmes gave a thin smile, unfazed by the inspector's tone. Quite so. There's something still flickering in the darkness of this case, and I intend to find its source before the flame dies entirely. Lestrade gave an exasperated huff, but stepped aside, allowing us to pass. As we made our way across the gravel path, the manor loomed behind us, like a watchful giant. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, though I could see no figures at the windows dot inside the chapel. The air had turned even colder. The scent of wax and dust lingered heavily, and the discolored patches on the altar cloth remained untouched since the night of Lord Ashgrave's death. Holmes moved with deliberate precision, his gaze flicking from the candelabras to the floorboards, to the peculiar scratch marks near the base of the central pew. It is here, he muttered to himself. It must be here. I watched as he withdrew a small magnifying lens from his coat and crouched near the stone pedestal upon which the mysterious candle had rested. He scraped gently at its surface, examining something barely visible to the naked eye. What is it, Holmes? I asked, intrigued. A residue, Watson, and not just wax. He sniffed it delicately, his nose wrinkling. Some sort of phosphorescent oil, something used in theatrical productions or perhaps chemistry experiments. It would glow for a short time after exposure to flame or friction. So the candle was tampered with? Holmes nodded slowly. Precisely. And yet it was not merely a trick of chemistry. Someone used it to create a misdirection, to convince the onlookers that the candle possessed supernatural properties. He turned and fixed me with a pointed look. Tell me, Watson, what happens when the lights go out and fear creeps in? One sees things that aren't there, I answered. Exactly. And sometimes one fails to see the things that are. He stood and turned back to the shadowed corners of the chapel. There's something we're missing still. Something not shown, but implied. At that moment the chapel door creaked open, and a familiar figure stepped in Miss Eliza Harrow, the quiet and sharp-eyed niece of the late Lord Ashgrave. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said softly, her voice carrying eerily in the cold air. But I couldn't help wondering. You found something, didn't you, Mr. Holmes? Holmes inclined his head. I found an absence, Miss Harrow, which is often more telling than any presence. She tilted her head. Intrigued, Holmes continued. Your uncle's death was meant to appear sudden, inexplicable, a heart attack brought on by fright. But the presence of the candle, its odd behavior, and the untouched state of his surroundings all suggest something far more deliberate. She drew a sharp breath, and I could see her hands trembling slightly. You think someone murdered him? I believe your uncle was frightened, yes, but not by phantoms, by someone he knew, someone close, someone who understood his guilt. Her expression darkened, and for a brief moment I thought she might confess something then and there, but she simply turned away, her eyes focusing on the stained glass window that filtered light in shades of crimson and gold. My uncle had many secrets, she said, and few friends. He was not a kind man, Dr. Watson. He was manipulative, cruel even, especially to those he thought he could own. Holmes's voice was like a blade, including your mother, Miss Harrow, stiffened. Her voice was colder when she replied, "You know more than you've said. I know that Lord Ashgrave forced your mother into silence over an inheritance dispute with the Chapel Trust. I know she was left destitute while your uncle continued to profit from the estate, and I believe someone in this house knows exactly what he did, perhaps more than one." A silence fell between us, thick and charged. Then she whispered, "Be careful, Mr. Holmes. There are shadows here that linger longer than they should." With that, she turned and left, her footsteps fading down the hallway like echoes of the past. Holmes stood still for a moment, then turned to me. "You see, Watson, we now begin to understand motive, but we must still decipher the method." We returned to the drawing room where the Ashgrave family had gathered. Lady Theodosia, still pale and composed, Mr. Jasper Merton, the cousin with an interest in alchemy, and Reverend Elliot, the clergyman whose sermons I recalled, leaned unusually often into judgment and damnation. Holmes addressed the room. "I must ask a favor. Would each of you be willing to reenact the moment the candle was placed and extinguished during the vigil? I believe the arrangement of the scene holds more than simple theatrics." There were murmurs of protest, but eventually each agreed. We moved once more to the chapel, and under Holmes's direction, the candelabra was lit again, just as it had been on the night of the incident. Lady Theodosia lit the central candle. Jasper stood to the left, Reverend Elliot to the right. The light flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. "Now," Holmes said, "Lady Ashgrave, when you noticed the candle burning strangely, what exactly did you see?" She hesitated. It didn't dim like the others. It seemed to grow brighter, even as the others went out." "Yes, and you saw no one approach it?" "No one." "And—" Holmes moved behind her, studying the angle of the candle's reflection in the glass of the organ casing. Then, with sudden energy, he climbed the pulpit stairs and pulled at a section of the wooden rail. A small latch gave way, revealing a hidden cavity dot from within it. He extracted a curious item, an old mirror pane attached to a rod and coated with soot on one side. "Elementary optics," he said. "Someone redirected the light of the nearby candle using this device, creating the illusion that the central flame burned while the others died. A parlor trick, nothing more." "But why?" I asked. "To isolate Lord Ashgrave, to confuse the witnesses, and most importantly, to conceal the true method of death." Lestrade, who had followed us in silently, stepped forward. "You're saying this wasn't a death by fright, then?" "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that Lord Ashgrave was dead before the candle went out, possibly even before it was lit." Gasps echoed around the room. Watson stepped closer to me. "Holmes," I whispered, "are you suggesting poisoning?" Holmes gave a tight nod. It would explain the lack of struggle, the calm expression. a rare paralytic, perhaps odorless, tasteless, delivered through wine or food or something more personal. As we returned to the parlor, the tension was palpable. Each person's eyes darted about the room, calculating, and yet Holmes said nothing more. His gaze drifted out the window to the gloomy estate grounds. The candle, it seemed, had not burned out on its own. It had been snuffed by human hands, and those hands were likely very near. Chapter 10. The alchemist's journal. The fog outside Ashgrave Manor had thickened by the hour, turning the windows of the drawing room into gauzy panes of gray distortion. Within, the silence was so complete that even the ticking of the grandfather clock felt accusatory. Holmes stood with his back to the fire, hands clasped behind him, while I remained seated near the hearth, notebook in hand, though I had ceased. Writing. Each of the remaining residents of the house was present. Lady Theodosia sat ramrod straight on the velvet settee, her white-gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap. Reverend Elliot stood by the mantel, his eyes downcast, whispering verses I couldn't quite catch. Jasper Merton, ever the enigma, hovered near the decanter at the sideboard, swirling a brandy he hadn't yet tasted. "I find myself in need of paper," Holmes said abruptly. Lady Theodosia blinked. "Paper?" "Specifically, the journal your cousin kept in his study, the one with the sigil of the Ouroboros embossed on its spine." Jasper Merton's hand froze mid-sip. "That book belonged to me," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It is filled with personal research notes, alchemical mostly." "Just so," Holmes replied, "and I believe it contains the key to understanding not just your eccentricities, Mr. Merton, but also your cousin's recent paranoia." Jasper's lips twisted into something between a smirk and a grimace. "You believe alchemy killed Lord Ashgrave?" "I believe what he believed killed him," Holmes said. "Now, if you please." For a moment, Merton hesitated. Then, with a shrug, he placed the untouched brandy on the tray and left the room. Lestrade leaned closer to Holmes. "You really think there's something in that book?" Holmes gave a small nod. "A man who surrounds himself with symbols, especially ancient ones, rarely does so without intent. Lord Ashgrave's fascination with eternal flame, rebirth, and judgment suggests a psychological fixation. I suspect Jasper's writings only fed it." Moments later, Merton returned, a thick leather-bound journal clutched in one hand. He offered it to Holmes with a theatrical bow. "I'd advise caution, Mr. Holmes. The last man to read this was dead within the week." "I dare say I've lived through worse curses," Holmes replied dryly. He flipped the journal open, scanning pages filled with cramped, looping handwriting. I leaned in, catching glimpses of strange diagrams, transmutation circles, notes on mercury vapor, and even a sketch of the Ashgrave family crest entwined with the OUROBOR. OS. Holmes stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "Here, Watson, read this aloud." I took the journal and read, "Should the soul be weighed in life rather than death, then surely the fire is its balance, the final judgment delivered not by heaven, but by the hand of man. Only through purification can inheritance be made clean." Holmes turned sharply to Jasper. "What did your cousin believe he needed to purify?" Jasper laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Himself, I think. Or perhaps the family name. He was obsessed with the idea that some ancient wrong tainted the Ashgrave bloodline. He was convinced that the candle held power, not spiritual, mind you, but symbolic, a reckoning. Holmes snapped the journal shut. Symbols are dangerous. Things in the hands of frightened men. Lady Theodosia stood. Do you mean to say he took his own life because of guilt? Holmes paused. Not quite, but we are narrowing the field. Tell me, was there anyone in this house who stood to gain, directly and financially, from his death? She stiffened all of us. But the majority of the estate falls to Eliza by special clause in the will. Unless, of course, it can be proven that her side of the family is unfit. The clause was added last autumn. Convenient timing, murmured Holmes. And was it Eliza who pressured her uncle to alter it? On the contrary, said Jasper. He insisted, claimed he needed to make amends. She never asked for a penny. Holmes gave a slow nod, which suggests he had recently learned something that filled him with guilt and the need for atonement. The clock struck the hour 4 chimes that echoed through the parlor, like knocks upon a coffin. Then came a sudden sound of crash, distant but distinct. Holmes and I were on our feet instantly. Lestrade drew his revolver. The chapel, Holmes said grimly, or near it. We raced through the corridor, our footfalls loud upon the tiled floor. The air grew colder the closer we drew to the western wing. When we reached the chapel door, we found it ajar dot inside. The scene was chaos. The altar cloth had been disturbed, a candelabra knocked to the floor, and there, crouched near the pedestal, was Eliza Harrell, her fingers stained with soot and wax, her face pale as death. I didn't know you were returning, she said quickly, rising. I came to look again at the candle. Holmes did not miss a beat. And what did you expect to find, Miss Harrell? A ghost? Or something rather more corporeal? She stared at him, her composure cracking. I thought perhaps I'd overlooked something. Like a hidden vial? Holmes asked softly. One used to poison a goblet? She said nothing. You knew, Holmes continued. You suspected even then that someone had laced your uncle's communion wine. Her expression shifted from fear to guilt to reluctant confirmation. I wasn't sure, she whispered. But the night before, I saw someone in the study, near the wine cabinet. I thought it was Jasper. We turned to look at Jasper Merton, who had just entered. Behind us, he blinked, astonished. Me? Good Lord, what are you accusing me of? Holmes raised a hand. Nothing yet, but your alchemical experiments may not be as harmless as you pretend, especially if one of them found its way into Lord Ashgrave's wine. You think I killed him to reclaim the estate? Jasper said, aghast. I'd sooner burn the place down. Holmes tilted his head. That may be truer than you realize. He stepped forward, brushing a finger over the rim of a small silver chalice, still resting upon the altar's side shelf. A residue clung to the edge, a dull, chalky film. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Have this tested. I believe it will contain traces of aconitine derived from monkshood, a paralytic in small doses. In large ones, well, you see the result. Lestrade took the cup, cradling it as though it might explode. You think this is what killed him? I know it, Holmes said flatly. The rest was theater. The candle, the mirror, it was all staged to appear as though divine retribution had descended. But the real flame that killed Lord Ashgrave burned long before the vigil began. Silence fell. Then Holmes turned slowly. his gaze sweeping across the group. The question now is, who knew of Aconitine's properties? Who had access to both the wine and the knowledge to administer it discreetly? Who stood to gain by discrediting Eliza Harrow or silencing Lord Asgrave before he could further amend the will? No one answered, but the room, already cold, seemed to grow colder still. In that moment I felt that the sensation Holmes had warned me about, not the presence of something, but the absence, the missing piece of the puzzle. And Holmes, I could see, was on the verge of fitting it into place.